Hello, bonjour, namaste. Welcome to the Canada and India show, where we meet the people that make up the vibrant Canada-India relationship. Every week, we interview leaders in their fields to dive into who they are and what drives them. From the arts, to trade, to human rights, we will discover together how rich and diverse this relationship really is.
Hi, I'm Annie Dubé, Canada's Consul General in Mumbai, India, and you're listening to the Canada in India show. Our guest on this episode is Frédérick Lavoie, a Canadian writer and journalist from Chicoutimi in the province of Quebec. He is best known for his book Avant l'après, Voyage à Cuba avec George Orwell. Before the After, Travel to Cuba with George Orwell, which won the Governor General's Award for French Language Nonfiction in 2018. Frédérick is an independent foreign correspondent whose work has appeared primarily in La Presse and Le Devoir, two French-Canadian newspapers. He spends his time between Mumbai and Montreal, and since we're both Québécois, it was interesting to gain his perspective on life as an expat in India. Frédérick Lavoie, thank you so much for joining us today on the Canada in India show. We're really excited because you reside here in Mumbai, and you're originally from the province of Quebec in Canada. And I'm always curious as to what brings you to India. And I mean, this country, there's so much to fall in love with. And I understand that's what brought you to India in the first place.
Yeah, actually, in the second place, I would say, because I've been a freelance foreign correspondent for 15 years now. Mostly I've been in Russia for 4 years before coming to India. Actually, after 4 years in Russia, I started to look for another place to stay. I wanted to go in a place where my horizon would be challenged, where, my understanding of the world would be challenged. And I thought India could be a good place for that. And I think I got for my money by coming here. So I came here the first time in 2012 for a trip, 2 months and a half. I went around India. That's when I met my partner, who's now my wife, and we've been together since then. So it was another good reason to settle in India. So I spent 2 years in India as a journalist. So from 2013 and 2014. So reporting, talking on radio, writing in French Canadian newspapers. And so that's through journalism that I've understood India a lot, because that's what brings you on the field, meeting people, trying to understand this country. And it's, of course, through readings also. So my own experience in the reading of nonfiction books, fiction books, and all this.
So what is the most important feature for you from your time in India? You arrived in 2012. We're now at 2019, 7 years later. What makes you still excited about India?
For me, it's really the complexity. I've traveled and I've reported for more than 30 countries in the world. But India, I still feel that I'm only on the surface. Because in every topic you will approach, you'll find out that it's much more complicated than it looks like, because there'll be questions of language, of religion, of course, men and women differences. So socio-political aspect, there's so many things and so many nuances within this that it's a very hard country to grasp. And that's why actually during these years since I'm in India, I've mostly been writing about other countries. My next book project is in Bangladesh. And even though it's a country that is quite similar to India, of course, they were once one country, but it's a country with a clear majoritarian group of linguistic and religious group, which makes the country having more cohesion maybe, and that it's easier maybe to understand a country like Bangladesh, even if it's very complex, of course, or a country like Cuba, on which I wrote a book also recently, than understanding India and all these layers of differences. And so that's this challenge that India represents that makes such that I feel I'll never go, I'll never understand completely India. And I'll always have to be careful about how I depict India to a Canadian audience. And I find it thrilling, actually, to always have to keep in mind that there's things I cannot say. And that's what journalism is. Journalism is, as a foreign correspondent, you have to simplify things for your audience without lying, being still accurate, even if you cannot tell everything. You have 600 words, you have 10 minutes on radio, you have to be concise, but still you have to make people understand. And, one article or one conversation after the other, you try to bring something new for the comprehension of your readership or your audience.
7 years in India is quite a lot to accumulate a certain knowledge. So how do you see the society developing with all its complexities? And I would love your take on that.
I mean, what I always found fascinating with India is how it stick together, despite all of this. And what makes India stick together, it still is its democracy. Even though, of course, there are many challenges, there's many flaws in the democratic system, as in other countries. And this is a country of 1.4 billion almost people with a lot of social differences, as we know. So there are all these challenges. But if you compare to other countries around that have more autocratic way of governing, I think that's what allows us to think that India actually will always be there, that it won't collapse because there are these institutions that are working. And to me, that's been installed. I have to say, I don't admire many politicians, but I have quite an admiration for Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, who, of course, had flaws also, as any politicians, but who could still create institutions that would allow this country to function, to create secular institution in a country where religion is so important, to create democratic institution, to create division between the different level of powers. And therefore, I think up to this day, that's what has made such that even when there are politicians who are more autocratic, as it happened in different countries, they cannot go totally against the spirit of India, the spirit that has been put together by Nehru and others at the beginning of the country in 1947. That's what I think I find the most fascinating. India is going slowly. Democracy also means that when you want to implement a project, you have a lot of protest, a lot of people who are against this protest. We see, for instance, in Mumbai with the metro, it's very long. If you would have done this in China, it would have been finished much sooner, but some people would have suffered and wouldn't have had their say on the project. So that's one thing I admire in India. Everyone does have a voice, even if there's all these differences and all these inequalities.
When you go back to Canada, India is such a mysterious country, and depending on where you go, there are several Indias. And so what is that key thing that you want to share with your family and friends so you make sure that they start having a sense of what India is all about?
I'm trying to explain this complexity. I think that's fascinating to explain to people that when you tell them this happened between these two people, but you have to understand that the caste or the class can have an influence that, we wouldn't perceive in another country like Canada. We wouldn't think that these could have an influence because they don't pop up the same way in India as they do in a place like Canada. So I think I'm trying to explain to them how seeing the world through the glance of India really makes you see humanity as something that can be very different from what you know, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. And that's what India brought to me, and that's what I'm trying to share in telling all these stories that can happen in India. Because when I'm reading the newspapers in India every day, I see news, just small articles of 4 or 5 lines that would actually be the headline in Montreal, for weeks. So much is happening in India. But sometimes I think the only way to explain India, and I've been trying for so many years, is through small events, small events that you can then unravel the details of and explain, as I said, one part of India, not everything.
What we see often from an outsider's perspective is obviously the large population, but also that probably half of the population is still poor, extremely poor. And there are social challenges. How do you see India overcoming these challenges?
I think from what I can see, it's getting better, getting somewhere. I mean, we see, of course, when I just arrived in India to settle here, I was there during the Delhi rape case in the bus, so it was something that has really shocked India. And it was, of course, a terrible case. But the good news on that is that it shocked people and that people reacted. And so we should see also the positive aspect in the reaction of the people. And since then, a lot of things have changed. I mean, things, as in any society, change slowly. But I think in the case of women, I see it going on in the right direction. Women are taking more space in India, and that's positive. I've learned also a lot of things because, as a man, of course, you're not always aware of the problems that women are facing. But I still remember reading a book, Why Loiter, by three prominent feminists from Mumbai. I think they're all from Mumbai, where they were talking about how, in some spaces, for instance, in some parks, there would be fences everywhere. And I was annoyed because there was only sometimes one entry to a park and then you couldn't go out from the other side. But I never thought that it could be an issue for women, security issue for women, So there's a lot of people thinking and trying to implement these changes in the society. Again, it go probably too slow for a lot of people, but things are going in the right direction. And again, I think we can point towards democracy that makes such that when people have complaints, they can petition their government or they can petition court. And this balance of power between the courts and the government and the legislative and the executive branches, the equilibrium between the courts and the legislative and the executive branches really helps this country going forward, because the government has to respond when the Supreme Court has a judgment. We've seen on homosexuality. It took a long time before Article 377 on homosexuality was completely abolished. There was a back and forth between court and the government, but it did happen. It did happen, and you can see this on many things. People were not happy with the Aadhaar card system. They petitioned the government, and the court has forced the government to bring some changes to ensure the protection of privacy, private data. And so these things happen, and this I find very encouraging for this country.
This is quite great. Someone said at one point that Mumbai cannot be described, it should be experienced. What marked you most in the last few years?
To me, it's to walk on the street and, the more knowledge you have about the different communities, for instance, the history of the city, the most you can notice things. And so just walking through Mumbai and looking at buildings, looking at people and trying to understand who they are by their appearance, by the language they speak. You need some time to be able to differentiate Hindi from Marathi, like when you're a foreigner, or other languages from Gujarati, of course, since there's a lot of Gujaratis here, and my in-laws are Gujarati speaking, so I hear it a lot. So just this to me is the most interesting, and to figure how can these work? How can this unity in diversity work? And just to look at this is very interesting, and that's why I'm not writing that much about India. I'm overwhelmed often because there's so much that could be written about that sometimes it lets you powerless and you don't know what to write.
What is your biggest hope for India in the next few years or the next decade? Where would you hope India to reach in terms of socio-economic development?
I think I wish it would strive more for equality, of course, between men and women, towards a decasteization, let's say, of the society, because still a lot of the caste system, is apparent and has an influence on the life of a lot of people, so that the people down the socio-economical and religious level have more of a say and can go up. I would wish also that they would continue to, or actually they would save the institutions that are the social institutions, because yes, there is technically free healthcare and free education in India, but in fact, anyone who has some money will go in the private sector. So all these systems that are in place are abandoned by some of the people, and there's a privatization of all, even the water supply, for instance. Even in slums, you will rely on a private contractor. You'll probably pay your water more than richer people are paying. But so all these privatization, I think, have also helped the inequalities to grow. So these are, I think, challenges that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. You're touching on a lot of points, and I don't think we'll have enough time to unpack everything. But if there's one thing that you would like to suggest to the Indian government in terms of one action to be taken so that India can reduce the inequalities between the rich and the poor, what would it be?
To continue to work on education for women. And education for actually everyone, because I think that maybe one flaw of the Indian state's creation is that there's been a lot of energy put on higher education. There's engineers from India that are wonderful and that are, top level in the world. But a lot of people remain poor and have very limited access to education, or at least to good education. And I think primary education is really the key, because a lot of people are poor because they don't have access to education, and the only thing they can give is their labor, their hands as workforce, and therefore they are cheap labor. And it makes such that instead of buying a big truck to carry some material, you'll use 10, 15 humans. But if these people would have more education, they could work in a better position, in better conditions, and they would actually at the end help the country better. And they would be better off, and the country would be better off. So primary education to me is the key, and that's what has to be solved now.
Frédérick Lavoie, thank you so much. I love your passion. I love that we have a friend and a strong representative of Canada here in Mumbai, and I'm looking forward to having more discussions with you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Pleasure. Bye.
That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. We're talking to Taslim Somji next week. She's worked for over a decade with the Toronto International Film Festival and has worked with the Dubai International Film Festival as well. She's also co-produced short films. She joined us for a conversation on film, leadership, and finding your own path. Hope you can join us for next week's episode.
We are thrilled that you shared this time with us today. We'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on our social media channels. On Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we are at Canada in India. You can listen to all our episodes wherever you get your podcasts, so please do subscribe. Thank you. Merci. Dhanyavad.